The Vanishing. 7 years ago, Catherine Wilson had everything she had ever dreamed of: a loving husband, Daniel, and their beautiful, spirited daughter, Claire. Their family was not perfect, but it was filled with laughter, shared meals, and plans for the future. The cruise was supposed to be another one of those shared adventures, a time to relax, to escape from the stress of everyday life, and to celebrate Claire's milestone, her 18th birthday. They had set sail from Miami, boarding a magnificent white and gold ocean liner that cut through the deep blue of the Atlantic like a floating palace. Catherine still remembered the way Claire's eyes had lit up when she first stepped onto the deck, the way she twirled in excitement as the salty wind tousled her blonde hair. "If this is what adulthood feels like," Claire had laughed, "then I'm all for it." Daniel had chuckled, pulling both her and Catherine into a hug. "Then let's make this the best week of our lives." Catherine wanted to hold on to that moment forever, because she had no idea it would be the last time she would ever feel truly happy. The disappearance. The cruise had been smooth sailing for the first few days. They had spent hours lounging by the pool, sipping tropical drinks under the sun, and exploring different islands along the way. When they docked in Curacao, a picturesque stop in the Dutch Caribbean, Catherine had thought the island was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. The streets were lined with colorful colonial-style buildings, the air smelled of sweet tropical flowers, and music drifted from open cafes. They had stopped at a small cafe near the docks, ordering fresh mango juice and pastries. Claire, ever the independent spirit, had asked if she could take a short walk on her own. "Mom, I'm 18, she had said, rolling her eyes in mock exasperation. "I'll just be down the street. I'll meet you guys back here in 15 minutes. Catherine had hesitated. But Claire was right. She was legally an adult now, and they were in a crowded, tourist-filled area. What was the worst that could happen? "All right," Catherine had said, reluctantly. 15 minutes. No more. Claire had flashed her a grin and disappeared into the crowd. That was the last time Catherine saw her daughter. 15 minutes turned into 30, then an hour. Daniel had gone to look for her while Catherine paid the bill, but when she stepped out onto the street, he was nowhere in sight either. At first, she hadn't panicked. She assumed they had just missed each other in the crowd. Maybe Claire had gone into a shop, and Daniel had followed. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the fear began to set in. By the time the ship was preparing to leave port, Catherine was frantic. She reported their disappearance to the ship's security team, who contacted local authorities. They searched the streets, checked nearby shops and restaurants, even questioned vendors and passers-by. No one had seen them. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The endless search. Catherine didn't return to the cruise. She refused to leave Curacao without her family. For weeks, she stayed, pleading with the local authorities to continue the search. She walked the streets at all hours, clutching photos of Claire and Daniel, stopping strangers to ask if they had seen them. She put up posters in every possible location. She scoured the beaches, fearing the worst. But there was nothing. No leads, no witnesses, no evidence. Eventually, she was forced to return home to Orlando, devastated and alone. The following months were a blur. The police conducted investigations, but as time went on, the case grew colder. There was no ransom note, no demands, no proof of foul play. Just two people disappearing in broad daylight. Catherine refused to give up. She hired private investigators, spent her life savings chasing every lead, followed every piece of information that hinted at Claire or Daniel's whereabouts. Each time, she was met with disappointment. The world moved on, but she remained frozen in time. 7 years later, now sitting in her dimly lit living room, Catherine stared at the detective sitting across from her, his words slicing through her like a blade. "Mrs. Wilson, we have exhausted every possible lead. I'm afraid the case is officially being marked as inactive." Catherine's hands clenched into fists. Inactive? No. You can't stop looking for them. They're still out there." Detective Mark Holloway sighed, rubbing his temple. "I understand how difficult this is." "No, you don't," Catherine snapped. "You don't understand what it's like to wake up every single day not knowing if your child is alive or dead. To not know if she's scared, or in danger, or if she's waiting for me to find her." She could hear the desperation in her own voice, but she didn't care. The detective looked at her with tired sympathy. "Mrs. Wilson, it's been 7 years." Catherine flinched as though she had been struck. "We're not closing the case," Holloway continued gently. "But we need to be realistic. Without new leads, we don't have the resources to actively keep searching." The words crushed her. Holloway reached into his bag and placed a file on the coffee table. "We will still follow up on any new tips that come in. But at this point, we need to consider the possibility that your husband and daughter may not be found." Catherine felt as though the walls of the room were closing in around her. She was losing them all over again. A flicker of hope. That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of missing person posters and reports, staring at the faces of her husband and daughter. Then, as she reached for her glass of water, her phone rang. She almost ignored it. Over the years, she had received so many calls from fraudsters, people claiming to have seen Claire only to try and scam her for money. But something in her gut told her to answer. "Hello, Mrs. Wilson." The voice on the other end was a woman's, thick with a Dutch accent. "My name is Sophia van Dijk. I am calling from Amsterdam. I think I saw your daughter." Catherine's heart stopped. She gripped the phone, her breath catching in her throat. What did you say?" "I'm not entirely sure," the woman continued. "But I saw a young woman at a bar last night. She looked just like the girl in your missing posters. I recognized her immediately." Catherine felt her hands begin to tremble. Where did you see her?" Sophia hesitated. "In the red light district." Catherine's blood ran cold. "I don't know what her situation is," Sophia said. "She was with a man, but something about it seemed off. She looked nervous. I wanted to approach her, but I wasn't sure. So I looked up her name online, and I found your number." Catherine's mind raced. She had heard the horror stories. Young girls being trafficked, taken from their homes, forced into lives of captivity. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, refusing to believe it. "No, Claire wouldn't." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson," Sophia interrupted gently. "But I think you need to come to Amsterdam." Catherine's world tilted. For 7 years, she had waited for a sign. Now she had one. And she was going to follow it, no matter what it took, across the ocean. Catherine Wilson sat motionless in her dimly lit kitchen, clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The voice on the other end of the line, this stranger, Sophia van Dijk, was still speaking, but Catherine could barely process the words. Her heartbeat roared in her ears. Amsterdam. Claire. Could it really be her? She had dreamed of this moment for 7 agonizing years, yet now that it had arrived, uncertainty flooded her. What if this was just another false lead? Another cruel hoax, like the ones before? But something in Sophia's voice, in the way she hesitated yet remained resolute, told Catherine that this was different. "Mrs. Wilson." Sophia's voice was softer now, gentler. "Are you still there?" Catherine swallowed hard. "Yes, I'm here. I know this must be overwhelming. I wish I had more answers for you. But I can tell you this, whoever she is, she looks like Claire. And she didn't look safe. I think you should come." Catherine squeezed her eyes shut, the words hitting her like a punch to the gut. She didn't look safe. If this was Claire, if she was alive after all this time, what had happened to her? Who had taken her? A choice lay before her. Stay here, let doubt and fear hold her back, or take the leap she had been waiting for all these years. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I'm coming." A flight of hope and fear. Catherine barely remembered booking the flight. packing a small bag, or even driving to the airport. Her body moved on autopilot, driven by sheer adrenaline. As she sat in the waiting area, her mind spun with possibilities. If Claire was in Amsterdam, where was Daniel? Had he been taken too? Or had he been lost in a way she couldn't bear to imagine? 7 years of hoping, of searching, of unanswered questions had left her exhausted, but she couldn't afford to break now. Her flight was called. She took a deep breath, clutched the only photograph she had of Claire, one from the last happy days on the cruise, and stepped onto the plane. For the next 9 hours, Catherine sat in restless silence, staring out at the black expanse of the Atlantic. She tried to sleep but couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind conjured new horrors. Claire trapped, Claire alone, Claire crying out for help, waiting for someone to find her. When the plane finally touched down in Amsterdam, it was already dark. The neon lights of the city blinked in the distance as she made her way through customs, her hands trembling with nerves. As she stepped into the arrivals hall, her eyes darted through the crowd, searching for the woman who had given her the first real lead in years. Then she heard it. Mrs. Wilson. She turned and saw a woman approaching. A tall, blonde Dutch woman with a kind but cautious smile. Sophia van Dyck. Following the lead. "I'm so glad you came," Sophia said as they shook hands. "You must be exhausted." Catherine nodded. "I barely slept." She hesitated, then forced herself to ask the question that had haunted her since she got on the plane. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure it was Claire?" Sophia's expression turned solemn. "I wouldn't have called if I wasn't. But there's something you should know." They walked to Sophia's car, the city lights casting a warm glow against the night sky. As they drove through the streets of Amsterdam, Sophia continued. "She wasn't alone," she explained. "There was a man with her. He seemed controlling, protective in a way that felt wrong." Catherine's chest tightened. "Do you think?" She swallowed. "Do you think she's being held against her will?" Sophia gripped the wheel tighter. "I can't say for sure, but I know fear when I see it." A cold shiver ran down Catherine's spine. The red light district. Sophia parked a few streets away, leading Catherine through the narrow cobblestone roads of the red light district. The area was alive with neon signs and thrumming music. Tourists wandered past glowing storefronts, while women stood behind glass windows, illuminated by crimson lights. The air smelled of perfume and cigarette smoke. Catherine's stomach churned. Claire would never be here. Not willingly. They stopped outside a small bar, the one Sophia had seen Claire in the night before. "I spoke with the bartender earlier," Sophia whispered. "He didn't recognize her name, but he remembered the man she was with. He said they come here often." Catherine's heart pounded. "Is there any chance she's inside now?" Sophia hesitated, then led the way in. The bar was dimly lit, crowded with locals and tourists alike. Catherine scanned the faces, her hands shaking. She saw nothing. Sophia walked to the bartender, speaking to him in Dutch. The man frowned, shaking his head, then pointed toward the back of the bar. "They were here earlier," Sophia translated, "but they left an hour ago." Catherine's stomach dropped. "Where?" He hesitated, then muttered something else. Sophia turned back to her. "There's a place nearby. A brothel." The bartender said they might have gone there. The world tilted beneath Catherine's feet. "No," she whispered, barely able to breathe. "No, that's not possible." But the fear in her gut told her otherwise. Sophia placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "We need to be careful. If she's there, she might not be alone. We can't just walk in and take her." Catherine knew she was right, but it didn't stop the rising panic inside her. They walked toward the brothel, a discreet building nestled between others, its red and purple glow casting eerie shadows. As they neared, Sophia suddenly grabbed Catherine's arm. "There," she whispered. Catherine followed her gaze. Behind a glass window, sitting on a small couch, was a young woman. Her blonde hair was slightly shorter, her face thinner, but there was no mistaking those blue eyes. Catherine's knees nearly gave out. It was Claire. It was her daughter, sitting behind a glass window, like she was for sale. The moment of truth. Catherine barely registered her own actions as she rushed toward the window, pressing her hands against the glass. "Claire," she gasped, her voice cracking. "Claire, it's me." The young woman inside looked up. For a moment, their eyes met. And then, nothing. No recognition. No relief. Just a blank, confused stare. A stranger's stare. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. "Claire, it's Mom," she begged, knocking harder against the glass. "Sweetheart, it's me. It's Mom. Please." But the young woman only stood up, her expression troubled, before disappearing into the back room. Catherine's entire world shattered. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No, no, no." Sophia grabbed her arm. "We need to go to the police. Now." But Catherine wasn't listening. She couldn't breathe. She had found her daughter, her beautiful Claire, after 7 years. And Claire had looked at her as if she were a complete stranger. The stranger's eyes. Catherine stood frozen in front of the glass, her pulse pounding in her ears like a drumbeat. The face she had longed to see for 7 years had just looked at her with utter indifference. No shock, no joy, not even a flicker of recognition. Claire, if it was truly her, had simply turned and disappeared. The moment felt unreal, like a nightmare where she was screaming, but no one could hear her. Her daughter was alive. And yet, she wasn't hers anymore. Behind her, Sophia's voice was urgent but steady. "Catherine, we need to leave. Now." Catherine's body refused to move. "She didn't recognize me," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Sophia gently but firmly grabbed her arm. "We don't know what's going on, but standing here won't help. The police are the only ones who can do something now." Catherine barely heard her. She pressed her hands against the glass again, as if somehow that would bring Claire back. What if she's drugged? What if they did something to her mind? She turned to Sophia, desperate, grasping for any explanation other than the worst. Maybe she has amnesia. Maybe she's being forced. Sophia's expression softened. "I don't know, Catherine. But I do know that if we keep causing a scene, we might put her in more danger." It was those words that finally made Catherine take a step back. If Claire was truly trapped in this place, making a commotion might only make things worse for her. Her hands curled into fists. "Fine," she said, her voice raw. "Let's go to the police." With one last, lingering glance at the empty window, she turned and followed Sophia away from the brothel. The police station. The Amsterdam police station was a stark contrast to the neon-lit chaos of the red light district. It was quiet, sterile, and efficiently run. Officers moved briskly through the halls, speaking in Dutch, occasionally switching to English when they noticed the 2 women standing at the front desk. Catherine couldn't stop shaking. 7 years. 7 agonizing years of waiting for a clue, for a whisper, for any trace of Claire. And now, after everything, she had found her daughter. But had she really? An officer approached, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. "You are the one who reported a missing person sighting?" she asked, her English crisp but accented. Catherine nodded. "Yes, I think my daughter is being held in a brothel." She looked at me, but she didn't recognize me. The officer's face remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened with interest. "Do you have proof that she is your daughter?" Catherine fumbled in her bag, pulling out an old, creased photo of Claire. The same one she had stared at for years. She handed it over with trembling hands. The officer examined it carefully. "And you are saying you saw her tonight?" Catherine nodded frantically. "Yes, just an hour ago, behind a window in the red light district. Please, you have to do something." The officer turned to Sophia. "You are the witness who called earlier." "Yes," Sophia said. "I recognized Claire from the missing person posters in Orlando. where I used to work. I saw her yesterday, and when I checked online, I found Catherine's contact information." The officer looked back at Catherine. "You said she did not recognize you." Catherine swallowed, her throat burning. "No." She looked blank, like I was just another stranger. The officer nodded slowly. "That could mean several things. If she has been missing for 7 years, she may have been trafficked, possibly brainwashed. Or," she hesitated, "there is also the possibility that it is not your daughter." "No." Catherine's voice came out stronger than she expected. "It's her. I know my own child." The officer studied her for a long moment before nodding. "We will send a unit to investigate. But I must warn you, cases like this are complicated. If she does not confirm her identity, we cannot force her to leave." Catherine stiffened. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that if she claims to be someone else, we will need proof, documentation, fingerprints, or a DNA test to confirm her identity." The word struck Catherine like a blow. What if Claire denied who she was? What if she truly believed she wasn't Claire Wilson? Her voice trembled. "And what if she doesn't cooperate?" The officer sighed. "Then we will have to determine if she is being held against her will. If she insists she is not the person you are looking for, it could take time to prove otherwise." Time. Something Catherine had already lost too much of. But she had no choice. She had to trust the police to do their job. "Fine," she said. "Just, please bring my daughter home." The officer nodded. "We will do our best." The raid. The wait was unbearable. Catherine paced the small waiting room, checking her phone every 2 minutes, even though there was nothing new to see. Sophia sat quietly nearby, her hands clasped together, watching Catherine with sympathy but knowing there was nothing she could say to ease her pain. Hours passed. Then, finally, an officer walked in. His face was unreadable. "We conducted the raid," he said. "We brought in the woman you identified." Catherine's breath caught. "It's she." "She is safe," the officer interrupted gently. "But there's something you need to see." He gestured for them to follow. Heart-hammering, Catherine followed him down the hall to a holding room. The large one-way mirror separated her from the inside. And there, sitting at a small metal table, was Claire. Catherine let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to the glass. Her daughter was sitting stiffly in the chair, her arms crossed. She was thinner than before, her once sparkling blue eyes now dull, her skin paler than Catherine remembered. She looked like Claire, but something was wrong. The officer turned to Catherine. "She claims her name is Erin Jansen." Catherine whipped around. "What? No, that's not possible." "She has identification to prove it." Catherine felt her world crumbling. "No, she must have been forced to take a new identity. Please, you have to question her. She's my daughter." The officer's voice remained calm but firm. "We will run a background check. But if she insists she is Erin Jansen, we cannot force her to say otherwise." Catherine turned back to the glass. Claire, or Erin, was staring at the table, her fingers drumming lightly against the surface. Did she really not remember? Or was she too afraid to say the truth? Tears welled in Catherine's eyes as she whispered, "What did they do to you, baby?" The first words. Minutes later, an officer stepped into the holding room and spoke softly to Claire. "No, Erin." The woman nodded, then slowly lifted her gaze toward the mirror. For the first time, her eyes locked onto Catherine's. A long silence stretched between them. Then, at last, Claire, or Erin, spoke. "I don't know you." Catherine's world shattered. She had finally found her daughter. And her daughter was gone. A daughter lost. A mother unbroken. Catherine staggered back from the one-way mirror as if she had been physically struck. The words that had just left Claire's, Erin's, lips cut through her like a blade. "I don't know you." Her daughter had looked her in the eyes and said it with such finality, such coldness, that Catherine felt her heart shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. She barely registered the officer speaking beside her. "I know this isn't what you expected," he said gently, "but we must consider the possibility that she truly does not remember her past, or that she has been led to believe another reality." Catherine's lips trembled. "No," she whispered. "She's my daughter. That's Claire. I know it." Sophia, standing quietly by her side, finally spoke. "Detective," she said, her voice steady, "there has to be a way to prove it. Catherine isn't just a grieving mother grasping at straws. I saw her face when she looked at Claire. She's certain." The officer exhaled slowly. "We will need to take extra steps. We will compare her fingerprints with the missing person database. But if she is resistant—" Catherine turned sharply toward him. "Resistant?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. She was taken. "Of course, she's resistant. Do you know how human trafficking works? They break you down. They convince you you're someone else." Her voice had risen, shaking with emotion, and the officer visibly softened. "I understand. But if she does not believe she is Claire Wilson, then we will need concrete evidence before we can take any legal action to reunite her with you." Catherine clenched her fists. She wasn't about to lose her daughter again. Not to bureaucracy, not to red tape, not to whatever sick manipulation had been done to her. She turned back to the window. Inside, Claire, no, Erin, was still seated, but her fingers twitched nervously against the table. She looked restless or scared. Something in Catherine's gut told her that Claire wasn't as unaffected as she seemed. She wasn't gone, not completely. But someone had buried her so deep inside that she didn't know how to surface. Catherine inhaled deeply. If she couldn't get to Claire as her mother, then she would do it as a stranger. "Let me speak to her," she said, her voice steadier now. The officer hesitated. "Mrs. Wilson, she doesn't remember me." "Fine," Catherine interrupted, her jaw tightening. "Then let me meet her for the first time." Sophia shot her a look, concerned, but supportive. The officer sighed. "All right, but no accusations, no pressure. If she truly doesn't remember you, forcing her to acknowledge a past she doesn't recall could traumatize her further." Catherine swallowed. What could be worse than the trauma Claire had already endured? The interview. The small, cold interrogation room smelled faintly of disinfectant and metal. The walls were gray and unwelcoming, and the single overhead light cast harsh shadows on the table between them. Claire, or Erin, sat stiffly in her chair, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. Up close, Catherine could see the faint hollows under her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the bruises on her wrist, as though someone had gripped her too tightly. The door clicked shut behind Catherine as she entered. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Catherine sat slowly, keeping her hands folded on the table. She had to tread carefully. If she pushed too hard, she might lose Claire forever. Finally, she broke the silence. "I'm Catherine Wilson," she said softly. The young woman across from her tilted her head slightly but didn't reply. Catherine hesitated. "What's your name?" A long silence. Then, quietly, almost mechanically, came the response. "Erin Jansen." The way she said it, too rehearsed, made Catherine's stomach twist. "Nice to meet you, Erin." Catherine forced her voice to remain even. "Do you know why you're here?" Another pause. Then, "I was taken from my home," Erin said flatly. "Wrongly accused." Catherine's breath caught. That's what they told her. That's what they made her believe. She forced herself to nod, to act as if she believed this version of events. "I understand that must be scary." Erin's fingers twitched slightly. Catherine decided to press, just a little. "You looked familiar to me," she said carefully. "That's why I asked to meet you. I used to know someone who looked like you. Same eyes, same smile." Erin's brows furrowed slightly. "You're mistaken." Catherine smiled, but it felt fragile. "Maybe. But humor me. Where did you grow up?" Erin hesitated. "Here, in Amsterdam." "Liar," Catherine's heart clenched, but she forced her expression to remain calm. Do you have any memories of when you were little? For the first time, something flickered across Erin's face. Uncertainty. Catherine didn't push further. Instead, she changed the subject. What do you like to do? She asked. Do you have hobbies? Erin shifted uncomfortably. I don't know. Catherine's chest tightened. Have you ever been on a cruise? A pause, a flicker of something. Then Erin shook her head. No. Catherine felt as if she were walking on glass, each step a risk of shattering everything. She leaned forward slightly. Are you happy? Erin's lips parted slightly, as if the question had stunned her. Then, finally, she whispered, I don't know. Catherine barely stopped herself from gasping. Because for the first time, that wasn't a lie. The breaking point. Catherine exhaled slowly. She needed one more push, something that would rattle the chains that had been placed around Claire's mind. So she reached into her bag and pulled out the object she had been carrying for years. A small seashell. She placed it gently on the table. Erin stared at it. It's from Curacao, Catherine said softly. A little island in the Caribbean. I once knew a girl who loved to collect these. Silence. Catherine watched as Erin's eyes locked onto the shell. Her fingers twitched again, as if something in her brain was trying to push through a fog. For a second, just a second, Catherine swore, she saw something flicker behind her daughter's gaze. Recognition. But then, Erin's expression twisted. Her breathing grew uneven. She pushed the shell away so fast it nearly tumbled off the table. I don't know you, she whispered, but this time, she sounded afraid. Catherine clenched her fists under the table. It's her. It's really her. She remembers something, even if she doesn't know it yet. But before she could say another word, an officer knocked on the door. We got the fingerprint results, he said. His voice was quiet. Catherine turned sharply, her heart pounding in her chest. The officer looked at Erin, then back at Catherine. Then he said the word she had been waiting 7 years to hear. She's Claire Wilson. Catherine's breath hitched. Her entire body sagged with relief, with exhaustion, with the weight of it all. But before she could celebrate Erin, Claire stood up so fast, the chair screeched against the floor. No, she said, shaking her head. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. That's not me. You're wrong. She turned away, backing toward the door, as if trying to escape. And then, before Catherine could stop her, Claire Wilson collapsed. A mind in chains. Claire crumpled to the ground before Catherine could react. The dull thud of her body hitting the cold linoleum floor sent a jolt of panic through the room. Claire. Catherine gasped, lunging forward. But before she could reach her, 2 officers had already moved in. One of them knelt beside Claire. Erin, checking her pulse while the other barked orders in Dutch. Sophia was at Catherine's side in an instant, gripping her arm. She's breathing, she whispered. She just fainted. Catherine barely registered the words. Her whole body was shaking. She had finally found her daughter. Finally, but Claire was slipping through her fingers. An officer turned toward her. Mrs. Wilson, please step back. She needs medical attention. I am her mother, Catherine snapped, her voice raw. I'm not leaving her. The officer hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but stay out of the way. As they lifted Claire onto a stretcher, Catherine felt the tight grip of fear clench her chest. What if she wakes up and denies everything again? What if she runs? What if she disappears forever this time? But as she looked at her daughter's face, too thin, too pale, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't leaving Amsterdam without her. The awakening. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor. Catherine sat at Claire's bedside, gripping her hand like a lifeline. She looked so fragile, so far from the vibrant girl who had once twirled on the cruise deck, laughing under the sun. The doctors had run tests, dehydration, stress, possible long-term substance exposure. Catherine's stomach had twisted at those words. They suspected sedatives or other drugs might have been used to manipulate her memory. Sophia sat nearby, offering silent support. The hours stretched painfully long. Then, finally, Claire stirred. Catherine sat up straight, her breath catching. "Claire," she whispered, hope and fear tangling in her chest. Claire's eyes fluttered open. But when they met Catherine's, the blankness was still there. Catherine swallowed the lump in her throat. "Hey, sweetheart." Claire frowned, as if the word tasted foreign. She turned her head slightly, eyes darting around the room in confusion. "Where?" Her voice was hoarse, unfamiliar. Catherine forced a smile. "You're safe. You're in a hospital. You fainted." Claire's gaze flickered with something unreadable. "I don't remember." Catherine felt her heart clench. "Do you remember anything?" "Before the police station." A long pause. Then, quietly, "I was at the bar." Sophia leaned forward slightly. "With the man?" she asked gently. Claire's body tensed. Her hands clenched the sheets. Her breathing became uneven. Catherine reached for her. Hey, it's okay. You don't have to." "I have to go," Claire muttered suddenly, struggling to sit up. "He'll be looking for me." Catherine's blood ran cold. "Who?" Claire blinked rapidly, her hands shaking. "Victor. He doesn't like it when I disappear." Sophia and Catherine exchanged a glance. Victor. The man who had been arrested at the brothel. Catherine's grip on Claire's hand tightened. "He can't hurt you. The police have him." But Claire shook her head, panic creeping into her features. "No, you don't understand. It's not just him. They'll come for me. I have to go." She tried to push herself up, but her body was too weak. Catherine placed a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "No one is coming for you, Claire. You're safe now." Claire's breathing was erratic, her fingers gripping the bed sheets like she was trying to ground herself. "Why do you keep calling me that?" Catherine's heart twisted. "Because that's your name." Claire's head shook violently. "No, I'm Aaron. I'm Aaron Jansen. I don't know you." Sophia stepped in, her voice calm. "You don't feel like you know her, but what if that's because someone made you forget?" Claire stiffened. "You fainted," Sophia continued. "That's not normal, is it? If everything was fine, if everything they told you was true, why does your body react like this when someone calls you Claire?" Claire's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but she couldn't. Catherine reached into her bag and pulled out the small seashell again. "You used to collect these," she whispered. "When you were little, you'd spend hours combing the beach for them. You said they reminded you of hidden treasures." Claire stared at the shell. She didn't reach for it. She didn't push it away. She just stared. Something was fighting its way to the surface. But before it could, Claire's body tensed again. "I need to go," she repeated, her voice more frantic now. "If they find me here, they'll hurt me." Catherine's breath caught. "Claire, who will hurt you?" Silence. For a moment, she thought Claire wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "The people who took me." The pieces began to fall. The police were contacted immediately. Detective Holloway, who had been following the case from the U.S., was looped in. He was already on a flight to Amsterdam. Meanwhile, Claire, or Aaron, remained in the hospital under police watch. She barely spoke after that confession. She seemed lost. Not just confused, but trapped inside herself. Catherine ached to reach her, to tear down whatever walls had been built around her daughter's mind. But she knew this had to be done carefully. Sophia stayed with her, comforting her when the silence became too much. Then, one night, as Catherine dozed in the chair beside Claire's hospital bed, she felt a tug on her hand. Her eyes snapped open. Claire was awake. But this time, there was something different in her expression. "Mom," she whispered. Catherine's breath hitched. It was the first time she had said it. Tears filled her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm here." Claire's brows furrowed as if something hurt in her mind. "I don't know what's real." Catherine swallowed. "That's okay. We'll figure it out together." Claire hesitated, her lips pressing together. Then, slowly, she whispered, "I remember. Someone taking me." Catherine felt her whole body go cold. "Who, Claire?" Claire's eyes darted to the door, fear creeping in. "I don't know. She swallowed. "They gave me new papers, new memories. Told me I was someone else." Catherine squeezed her hand. "You don't have to remember everything now. But whatever happened to you, we're going to fix it. You're safe now." Claire's fingers trembled in her grip. "I don't feel safe." Catherine's gut twisted. And then Claire's voice dropped to an almost inaudible whisper. "Because they're still out there. The shadow still looms." The police intensified their investigation. They combed through Claire's forged documents. They raided Victor's known hideouts. They traced connections to something bigger than a single missing girl. And then, 3 days later, a chilling discovery was made. There were others. Other women. Other missing girls. All linked back to the same network. The same men. The same organization. Catherine stood frozen in the police station as Holloway placed a thick file in front of her. "These weren't random abductions," he said grimly. "Claire was part of something much bigger." Catherine stared at the photos of other girls, other families torn apart. Her daughter's case wasn't just about one missing girl anymore. It was about all of them. And they weren't stopping until every single one was found. The fight for freedom. A mother's mission. Catherine sat in the dimly lit briefing room of the Amsterdam police station, surrounded by officers, detectives, and officials from Interpol. Papers were spread across the table, detailing every chilling discovery the investigation had uncovered. Claire had not been the only one taken. She was part of a network, a system, a business built on stolen lives. Her stomach churned as she scanned the files. Girls from all over the world. America, Europe, South America. All young. All vanished. Some had been taken from their homes. Others had been lured away with promises of adventure, love, or security. But all of them had one thing in common. They had been erased. Their identities had been rewritten. Like Claire. The thought made Catherine's hands clench into fists. She looked at Detective Holloway, who had flown in from the U.S. just hours earlier. He had been on this case since the beginning, and now, for the first time, they had real answers. "This network," Holloway said, his voice grim, "it's international. We've tracked transactions, documents, and fake IDs stretching across several countries. They don't just kidnap girls, Catherine. They own them. They strip them of everything. Names, memories, identities, until they don't even know who they are anymore." Catherine swallowed hard. And Claire, the lead Dutch investigator, Inspector Vos, exhaled deeply. "We have enough evidence to confirm she was taken in Curaçao, most likely drugged and transported under a new identity. Her captors likely worked with criminal groups who specialize in human trafficking. They smuggle girls through international shipping routes, falsify their papers, and sell them to handlers. From there, the girls are forced into controlled environments. Brothels, private parties, high-end clubs. Some disappear into underground markets, never to be found again." Catherine's vision blurred with rage. 7 years. 7 years of not knowing. 7 years of searching, crying, and feeling like she was losing her mind. And all this time, Claire had been trapped. Brainwashed. "I want to see her," she whispered, forcing back her emotions. Vos nodded. "She's still in the hospital, under protection. But Mrs. Wilson." Catherine met his gaze. He hesitated. "She is not the same girl you lost." Catherine stiffened. "I don't care. She's still my daughter." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Take me to her." Breaking the chains. The hospital was quiet when Catherine arrived. The police had stationed 2 guards outside Claire's room, ensuring that no one unauthorized could enter. Catherine hesitated at the door, her pulse quickening. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and stepped inside. Claire sat by the window, bathed in the soft glow of the Amsterdam skyline. She was still painfully thin, her skin pale, her posture tense. She didn't turn when Catherine entered. Catherine's heart ached. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly. Claire flinched at the words. Catherine crossed the room slowly, taking a seat beside her daughter. A long silence stretched between them. "I know this is hard," Catherine said gently. "I can't imagine what they did to you, what they made you believe. But you are Claire Wilson. You are my daughter." Claire let out a hollow laugh. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." Claire exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I don't remember being her." Catherine reached into her bag and pulled out an old photograph, one taken on the cruise, the last picture of them as a family. Claire, Daniel, and Catherine were all smiling, sun-kissed, happy. She placed the photo in Claire's lap. Claire stiffened. She picked it up hesitantly, staring at the girl in the picture. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Recognition. Catherine leaned forward. "I know it's buried deep, but the memories are still in there. They didn't erase you completely, Claire." Claire's hands trembled. "I don't know who I am," she whispered. Catherine swallowed hard. "Then let's figure it out together." The truth of that day. Over the next few days, Claire remained distant but didn't push Catherine away. She listened. Sometimes she even asked questions. Then on the fourth night, she finally said it. "I remember." Catherine nearly dropped the cup of tea in her hands. Claire sat rigid in her bed, her hands clasped together. "Not everything," she admitted, "but flashes, sounds, the ocean, Dad's voice, and that day." Catherine's breath caught. "What do you remember?" Claire exhaled shakily. "I left the cafe to walk along the docks. I remember watching the boats come in. That's when I saw them." Catherine's fingers curled around the bedsheets. "Saw who?" Claire hesitated, then whispered, "Two men. One of them was Russian, I think. He asked me for help, said he was lost. I turned to give him directions." Her voice broke. "And then there was a cloth, a smell. I remember struggling, but it didn't last long. Everything went dark." Catherine's nails dug into her palm. "I woke up in a shipping container," Claire continued, her voice distant. "There were others. Girls. They told us not to scream. That it wouldn't matter." Catherine covered her mouth, holding back a sob. "They injected us with something," Claire whispered. "They told us who we were. Made us repeat it over and over until we believed it." Tears slipped down Catherine's face. Claire looked at her, her expression breaking. "I want to remember. I do. But it's like my brain won't let me." Catherine took her hands. "Then we'll fight it. Together." The final battle. With Claire's memories resurfacing, the police now had enough to dismantle the entire operation. Victor, the man who had controlled Claire for years, had been just one cog in a much bigger machine. Through bank records, surveillance, and Claire's testimony, they traced the ring back to several key figures in Europe and South America. Interpol launched a massive international sting operation. Dozens of traffickers were arrested. And most importantly, several missing girls were found. But the biggest breakthrough came weeks later. One name on the traffickers' list sent a fresh wave of shock through Catherine's system. Daniel Wilson, her husband. The man who had disappeared the same day as Claire. His name had surfaced in the criminal database, not as a victim, but as someone who had been involved. Catherine's hands trembled as she stared at the file. "No," she whispered. "No, it can't be." Holloway exhaled. "We don't know everything yet, but there's a chance." "No," Catherine's voice broke. She turned to Claire. Claire's face had gone pale. "Mom," she whispered, her voice shaking. Catherine turned to the officer. "Find him." Her voice was no longer broken. It was steel. "Find my husband, Find out if he's the man I married or the man who took my daughter.